Welcome to Cryptic Accounts, a podcast by paranoid people for paranoid people. I am your host for the week, Dennis Cheney. And this week on the show, we have Zecharia Sitchn's Genesis Revisited. I'm joined as always with co-host, co-founder, co-CEO of the Cryptic Accounts Empire, Patrick Ryan. How are you?
I'm doing good, Dennis. Excited to see what's going on with Genesis this week.
This is a good old-fashioned, what's the deal with Genesis this week?
What's the deal?
What's the deal with the book of Genesis this week? Yeah, I'm not, we've been talking about UFO stuff the last couple weeks to start off the show. I'm still prepping the rebirth of cryptic headlines. So look out for that. But this week is just a very classic rabbit hole.
Oh, I guess before we get into all that, we should go back and revisit a little bit from last week's episode.
Right.
Which I bring up, but I did not take proper notes on like I should have. I can tell you overall, it was disappointing.
We had made, if you did not listen to last week, great show. However, once again, psychics have failed me. We did a review of this basic remote viewing farms report on what was going to happen at the inauguration.
Well, it was a remote viewer. I'm going to blank on her name now.
A very established remote viewer. But these were her.
It was her
students.
Class. Yeah, it was her students doing it. They got the weather right. It was cloudy and overcast. It was
in January.
I will say the teachers seemed to have some of the more relevant ones. It did seem, I understood, remember how one of the notes was like, and I think it actually might have been one of the students. I don't remember who it was that said it. But it talked about how it seemed like a very somber event and almost like part funeral.
Right. And also there was mention of, my big takeaway was there's a lot of mention of troops, which normally don't play a huge role in inaugurations. And a couple of people did mention like the big presence of troops, which did end up happening due to the whole like Capitol protest.
And I kind of there was also the note about how somebody saw him standing instead of sitting, and they took it as like an uneasy thing. And kind of seeing after the first couple of days, it kind of seemed like that may have been just him being very active in that first 24, 48 hours and not taking a posture of sitting and almost relaxing. I don't know, but again, that's an interpretation thing.
That's interesting. I mean, that could go both ways because the remote viewer herself saw it as an interpretation of the opposite. You know what I mean? So It's like, I'm still gonna get into remote viewing. I'm gonna haunt you at night.
Yeah, we're gonna do it. We're gonna do it. We need to follow up on. Kamala wore green, although they were pretty much across the board on different students who had different views on.
We had Kamala in red. We had Kamala in blue. We had her in beige. We had her in black.
I do remember there was only one person that said green, though. That wasn't one of the common ones. So
true. There was also the prediction that Melania Trump would show up without Donald and that she would wear green.
And I didn't pay attention. I meant to go back and look to see and I could be wrong. I think she might have been wearing green at the thing she was doing at Trump's send-off or whatever. I could be wrong about that.
I didn't watch enough news. That might be. I don't know. Ooh, that's interesting.
I didn't really watch that. I just saw clips. Yeah, if you check it real quick, I can sit here and babble about whether or not I could be right or wrong on this.
We're going to test your psychic abilities.
It could be that but I seem to remember a green hat and a green dress. Now, was that at that thing or was that something else that I just happened to see? I don't know.
I think you might have been like, okay. I can't find a picture. You listeners, let us know. We're here to tell you about the important things, not about who's president. We're here to we're here to tell you about giants and whatnot. No, I'm just kidding. I couldn't find it.
I
didn't
just
want
wanted to
spend.
follow
Yeah,
up on it. That may have been. I'll look. I'm sorry. I meant to check that before we came on and did this. And
I was not
forgot
super
about it.
impressed.
Mm-mm.
However,
As I watched, I did kind of look over my notes from that episode, and there wasn't a whole lot striking out there as far as. I mean, Biden was wearing a dark coat, but that was kind of an easy.
yeah, well, it's January, so the odds that there are clouds and then you wear a dark coat,
Yeah.
not a lot of presidents wear like yellow snow coats. Yeah.
He didn't break out his purple 3-piece suit with matching overcoat.
I will say the prediction that he would show up in a Riddler costume was terribly off, and I was really hoping that would be true.
That would have been great if that would have been one of their predictions.
I don't take this apparent failure, and I basically, to be honest, I see no success here. I don't think predicting that.
I named a few successes there, and like I said, I'm not doing a good enough job going back over. Gosh, I wish I knew her name off the top of my head. It's in the notes. If you're listening to this, you could literally scroll down to the one before, and I think I put her name in the notes.
I don't doubt her.
I know I didn't. I didn't put her name in the notes, so don't scroll. That's pointless.
They got to listen to the full episode. I don't doubt her or any of the other remote viewing actual veterans. I just think it was maybe an attempt to get some press by saying what do my students say?
Yeah.
And then it turns out the people who, if you're paying someone to teach you how to do it, you obviously haven't really learned it yet. And just like the whole Kamala was pictured in every single coat possible, I don't find the fact that some people knew that it would be cloudy in January or that Biden would be wearing a heavy coat. I don't find any of that convincing. I tried in the last episode to pick out the ones that would be really surprising, and none of those happened. There was mention of somebody showing up in a full-on widow's outfit with a veil.
No, that was an image of Queen Elizabeth or something like that.
Yeah, it was an image of a Queen Elizabeth type figure taking the Oval Office in a full veil.
I don't know that she was taking the Oval Office. I think you're now getting kind of confused about what was said on that.
All right. Well, bottom line,
I do remember that seemed to be a separate thing that was getting viewed. Okay, her name was Jeannie Mael. Okay. I had to pull my notes up because that was going to bug me, and
That's fine. And now it's bugging me if Melania was wearing green, but I'm not going to worry about it. People can Google it on their own. Wow, we're off to a strong start here.
Yeah,
man.
Sorry. We said we were going to talk about that, so I wanted to bring it up and kind of go back over that a little bit. I should have had better notes on that.
No, don't ever apologize. I love it, and hey, man, I thought that was a great episode, and actually, it got a lot of attention last week. I don't know if it's because it was about the inauguration on Inauguration Day, but for any of the new listeners, stick around, man. Tell us what you like and what you want to hear, and we take YouTube comments, we take podcast ratings and comments, we take emails. Seriously, we read everything all the time. Hit us up on social media. We did attract a lot of new listeners that day.
Yes, and thank you for the new reviews that we got in the different places where you get your podcasts. There's too many different ones to name at this point where you can download us. But I've seen a lot of different reviews on some of those sites, and I appreciate it. So thank you.
Yeah, so good show, Patrick. And I'm going to tell you right now, man. So my last show was Modern Dinosaurs.
Yep.
If you want to go too bad, I thought it was a fun episode.
It was a really fun episode.
Bottom line, dinosaurs still exist, man. It's just a fact. They don't want you to know about it. And so this was actually, I had planned on doing something a little more modern. Well, this is modern, but I had wanted to branch into some more UFO conspiracy stuff this week, but I was organizing my notes and research from last week and just trying to clean up my insanely messy desktop.
Why do I feel like you're getting ready to tell me we're actually doing Egyptians?
No, not Egyptians, but we're pretty close.
Oh,
We're
okay.
going back.
I was making a joke based on there's been a lot of episodes where like I was going this direction,
I know.
and then I ended up with the pyramids.
If you're a new listener, I tend to have a pitfall where I start on one thing and then a bunch of episodes ends up being either giants or Egyptians. But no, this was me.
You start pulling on a thread, and then you really go down a rabbit hole.
I do, and maybe that's just what I like.
I've done it too. I mean, I've done 2-parters and stuff. So
this might be a 2-parter.
Ooh.
Because I only got about halfway through about 400 pages of source material this time, and
wow,
and included some other research. And I personally, I didn't have time to finish the book, but I'm pumped to finish it. So this might be a 2-parter, and we might even end on a cliffhanger. Basically, what happened was when I was doing the dinosaurs episode, I was downloading everything from all our sources, and I downloaded a bunch of books. I bought a few books too. Anything that sounded like it would be like Jesus riding a dinosaur ish, you know what I mean? Like, is basically what I downloaded. And one of them was called.
What the show needs is Jesus riding a dinosaur for sure.
It's our mascot, probably.
Somebody draw that up. That would be amazing.
Please draw Jesus riding a dinosaur and Pat and me sitting like behind.
Okay. So
I had
riding the dinosaur with Jesus?
With Jesus, yes.
Okay. I hope that happens. I do not have the artistic ability to make that happen. But I hope
someone out there who listens to us with all the thousands of people. Somebody has to have caricature skills. You have to be able to put me. Even if you could just draw me in a go-kart, please send it to me. It will become our new show logo for a week. But I had essentially
that standard just dropped dramatically.
Jesus on a dinosaur, me on a go-kart.
Ride dinosaur. Look, if somebody could just draw me in a go-kart, that would make my day.
Maybe just with a big head and a tennis racket.
It's been a rough week. Yeah, me with a big head, possibly, an ice cream cone in my hand. That would be amazing.
So I'm going through this. I downloaded a book called Genesis Revisited.
Yes.
And I kind of just bought it offhanded because I was like, this is going to have my dinosaur stuff. Oh boy. No, it did not. I did not realize until I never ended up using it for the dinosaur show, but I realized afterward, earlier this week, that it was written by Zecharia Sitchn. And we've talked about this guy numerous times. He's the ancient astronauts, Annunaki, planet Nibiru. He's the guy who came up with all that.
Okay.
Who discovered all that, we will say. And he wrote a book basically methodically going through Genesis. And I'll tell you right now, I got through 200 plus pages of it, and we're pretty close to the beginning still. So I'm pumped to keep going through it. But today I basically prepped the show on what I had found in this book. I started reading it because I was like, oh, I didn't realize that was Zecharia Sitchn. And then as I kept going, I was like, I need to know what Nibiru guy has to say about the Bible, basically, because it's all around the same time period, etc. And I just dove in, and it's a bit of a ride so far.
Okay.
So
I'm excited.
Are you ready, man?
I am as ready as I'm probably gonna be.
Yeah, we got to state right off the fact, we have some strong opinions on this podcast. Views of the books we cover are not necessarily views of Patrick and Dennis. And this is a prime example. So this is a review, man. I started taking notes from chapter 1, The Big Bang Theory. And I'll call my first section here, The Big Bang Theory and Ancient Astronomy. So Sitchin starts out with, how you should start out any good book. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And we take the concept, and this is one thing he makes clear very early on, which I agree with. We take the concept of there being a beginning of the universe kind of for granted today. Due to the Big Bang Theory, but actually in history, the idea that chaos and not stability is the average state of things is basically new unless you look at scripture. So the idea that the ancient Hebrews would have guessed that the ordering of the universe began with a gigantic burst of light is actually even more remarkable when you look at what we've learned through science. Philosophers all the way up to the modern era have tended to assume that the universe was infinite in time, having no beginning or end. And modern science assumed the same thing until the Big Bang Theory, which was first conceived in 1927 by a Belgian scientist and Catholic priest, George Lemaitre. And in fact, even Einstein himself, long after he created the theories of relativity and stuff, believed that the universe was infinite, had no beginning and end, all the way up until the early 1930s. This is not, again, see, does that surprise you? Because this is something I've known for a while, but only because I love to read about this stuff.
Does it surprise me that up until the 1930s, people thought the universe had just always existed?
Yeah.
I mean, a little bit based on what I know about religion. So they think, they would have to think it was the beginning based on creation.
Well, yeah, but this is outside of creation. So most science, so prior to, well, Judaism was never a major, like, majority religion anywhere other than among Hebrews, right?
Yeah.
So outside of that in world history, almost every philosopher always thought that the universe was infinite. Now, Christianity became a dominant religion in Europe due to, became a dominant religion in Europe and adopted the Hebrew creation story. But outside of that, even scientists, Isaac Newton, etc., assumed that the universe was infinite. It was just assumed.
I guess that does surprise me a little bit, but I guess I had never really thought about, like, what did people think?
The dominant theory throughout human history, Greek philosophy, other philosophies, has always been that there is no beginning or end. And we're just in the stasis of a stable universe and everything works like clockwork. It's kind of like how, like, the basic assumption was for a long time that the earth is flat because that's what it looks like. Things look stable. You have seasons, they repeat. There's really no reason to believe there's a beginning or end. Yeah. And this kind of makes the biblical account pretty historically phenomenal.
Okay.
And like I said, even Albert Einstein and other major physicists of the 20th century had to basically be convinced by evidence that the Big Bang and the beginning was true. So basically, I did some research on this to confirm this, and it is true. I went into different Greek philosophers, different scientists during the Christian era in Europe, and the belief that the universe had a beginning was very uncommon when it came to science. And that mostly prior to the 1927 Big Bang announcement, this was pretty much relegated to Christian intellectuals. So, for instance, a kind of off-the-wall treaty in 1225 AD called On Light by the English theologian and a priest again, Robert Grosseteste, describes that an initial explosion created the universe, which eventually crystallized, in his words, into matter from stars to planets. And this On Light treatise is considered the first attempt to describe the heavens and earth with a single set of physics, and was written 420 years before Isaac Newton was even born, and is, of course, based on basically in the Middle Ages trying to extrapolate what science is from the book of Genesis.
Okay.
So Sitchn notes that this seems to be actually a very unexpected scientific intuition that's embedded in the very first sentences of the Bible, or Genesis. And that seems to be historically true. There seems to be no reason why this one particular tribe of people would basically have this idea that wouldn't become, other than the fact that their religion became popular, there's no reason. All philosophy and science leading up to basically this last century seemed to militate against the fact that we had a beginning of the universe.
Okay.
And then Anunnaki guy goes on quite the tangent. He starts out talking about the Bible, and then we go straight into Anunnaki. So this is something that will keep coming up in this episode and a review of this book. He basically starts taking credit at one point early. In the first chapter, he starts out talking about how amazing this Genesis discovery is, and I did my own research. Like, it is actually pretty amazing. And then immediately he starts bragging in the middle of the chapter about how he predicted what Neptune and Uranus would look like.
What?
Yeah. So he wrote a 1972 book about Nibiru, which we'll eventually do a full series on, called The 12th Planet. And in that, he predicted, based on ancient Sumerian texts and other new mythology, that when we eventually saw Neptune up close, it would look like a big ocean because the ancients associated it with an ocean. So he basically predicted that when we finally saw it, it would look kind of like what the ancients thought it would look like. He also made the prediction that Uranus would be bright greenish and have water, as opposed to being purely gaseous, as was assumed. And indeed, I'll give him this: the NASA's Voyager 2, when it finally flew by these planets and returned photos and data, which NASA analyzed, both of these predictions ended up being correct, whether it be coincidence or the knowledge of the ancients, as he attributes it to.
I mean, that's a 2 for 2 is pretty good.
It's pretty good. And one of the big themes here is that some of this stuff I get into with Sitchin or some of these other people, regardless of whether you think they're charlatans or they have fringe theories or whatever, they do seem to hit the nail on the head in odd ways that reminds us kind of how big our universe is. So, for instance, when I was reading this and then when I was researching it on the side, I kind of had forgot that we really hadn't seen these planets prior to like the 80s.
Yeah.
Like, we kind of knew they existed with telescopes and stuff, but like, we really, they're very far away. We kind of think of our solar system as this little thing inside of a bigger thing, but like, it's very far away.
Yeah.
Much farther away than Mercury or Venus or any of this stuff. And so he did nail 2 for 2. And these two do seem to match up with his predictions based on what the ancients said. So for instance, when the NASA Voyager 2 flew by the planets and returned photos, one NASA moderator on TV proclaimed in 1986, "My God, it's exactly as the Summerians described it."
Which, that's pretty freaky. I mean, really, like, how would the Summerians have possibly known that?
Yeah, it's weird. How would they know the color of a planet?
Yeah.
That we couldn't ascertain until, millennia later. I mean, we're talking 6,000 years ago.
Kind of seems like maybe somebody stopped by and told them or showed them.
Right. Which is, yeah, right.
Or showed them.
Or showed them. Or just flat out, yeah, told them or showed them. So at this point in my research, I was like, oh God, okay. I picked up this book because we're doing dinosaur stuff. Now I realize it's something different. I think it's about the Bible. I'm just like 20 pages in at this point, and we're already talking about the Anunnaki again, which is what I think has nothing to do with the Bible. And I'm fine with that, but it just wasn't what I was looking for. But it is interesting because these are distant planets. And here's what first got me, Patrick. I'm going to show you an image labeled "The Host of Heaven." And I'll describe it for our listeners who can't see. This might not look like much at first, but I'll break this down for you. So this is a 6,000-year-old Sumerian tablet called the Host of Heaven, and it depicts a king of sorts sitting on a throne with his wand or scepter or whatever, and he has these two servants. Now, if you look in between his two servants, you will see what appears to be a remarkable depiction of the heliocentric solar system. Do you see those?
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's like the sun and then planets around it. Now, this is, again, 6,000 years old. This is where Sitchin starts drawing me, and I'm like, oh no, maybe there's something to this. So this is even more interesting when you realize that the way this artwork was created. And for our listeners, basically, there's a king on a throne. There are two servants, and in the background, there's a depiction of the sun with, I believe it's 11 celestial bodies going around it, and one of those includes the moon. Now,
it is 11.
Yeah. Now, the way that the Summerians, and one of those includes the moon, so we got 10 planets here plus the moon. So the way the Summerians did this artwork is they would actually make these like cylinders, which I would compare. I did some reading into how these were created, and you know the way we do type print, how we create like metal letters, and then we rearrange them and press them. So they would create these cylinders with these works of art on them, and then basically roll them over clay.
Okay.
To create these like copies of this artwork. And when you unroll it, it becomes even more kind of eerie. So I've included here an image of basically the rolled out version of the Host of Heaven compared to a scientific picture of our solar system. Do you see that?
It's pretty close. There's one that's out of place.
It's pretty close, and I'm actually, oddly enough, I'm about ready to explain to you why that one's out of place. Okay. So it shows the sun in the center 6,000 years ago. It shows a number of planets, which are all basically in their correct orbit.
Yeah, it looks like got two. There's a few there's little details that are out of place.
There are, but I mean, this is a 6,000-year-old clay tablet that shows.
But again, like it doesn't necessarily, to me, like I don't know enough about how everything sits and moves to fully understand. Like that could be the way that they're at some point in time.
That's kind of the issue, and actually, that ends up kind of making this more likely to be accurate than not, and I'll explain. So these are basically all in place. Now, these are two different drawings, so they're not going to show the exact same thing in the exact same places, but it shows more or less the correct number of planets with the Earth's moon, and it seems to show, when you understand that it was made in this cylinder, a rotation pattern. Which shows these planets rotating around the sun. So he basically flattened it out and found this pretty remarkable similarity, considering that this is from 6,000 years ago. When you compare the distance and relative size, it matches very close to our planets on the moon orbiting the Earth. And it also shows that Neptune and Uranus are twin-like, which we did not understand it until the last century. Now, even more interesting, what appears to be a problem with the way that Pluto was not even discovered until 1930, by the way, and is depicted on this drawing. Pluto seems to be rotating the sun closer than Neptune, which puts the planets out of alignment. But we actually have discovered after 1930 that this actually happens during...
They switch sometimes?
They switch, yeah, because Pluto has such an odd orbit.
So they were right about that too.
Yeah, so they were right about that too. Basically, I summarize this as somebody knew about Uranus, and that's the big conspiracy here. That it's pretty weird. So this started getting me sucked in, and this is when I was like, we're doing a show about this. So At this point, Sitchin goes pretty deep back into Nibiru, which is his wheelhouse.
Which
And
is
he's
something we really, at some point, there's going to be a whole, unless this is it, there's got to be a whole Nibiru
for the
episode.
number of episodes that we have said we're going to do a full episode about it. It's time. It's pretty much time, and this is going to be like the prelude to that. I'm going to get into this work. We're going to finish Genesis. Maybe we'll even do a part 2 where we go back and explain all the Nibiru stuff. But he's big into it. He's kind of like, we hit these conspiracy figures. And I do not mean that in a derogatory way, but we hit these figures kind of like Albert Pike,
Mm-hmm.
who are just like so smart that they can suck you into anything. They could just not
Albert
that I'm
Pike,
big.
that was the Freemason guy.
You don't think he sucked some people into some stuff?
Oh,
I'm saying
thought you were
was
talking about us. I'm like, I did not feel like I got sucked into any kind of white supremacy KKK.
No, same.
Although I am probably on a list based on esoteric Hitlerism research.
You are literally
I'm
if you search Hitlerism on iTunes, we come up.
The FBI hasn't come by yet. It's a matter of time, though, I'm sure.
Right. But no, I just be like, Sitchin seems to be so smart that he can collect so much data from so many sources that he can start to make a case for just about anything. And that's kind of what Albert Pike was like. He knew like 12 languages, and he could just like draw connections between things. And I got a very similar vibe from this work. So at this point, we took like this tangent into look how much the ancient Summerians knew about cosmology. And going forward, basically what I found, even though he doesn't state it, is that there's kind of this thesis that the ancient Sumerian understanding of cosmology, and we'll get into how they came to learn these things, kind of filtered down into the Bible. Because the Mesopotamia, Samaria, eventually led into the Babylonians, which took a lot of those myths, and the Hebrews spent time enslaved there, etc. So he basically says that this has been codified in the Bible as well. And one aspect that he ties to the Psalms, Proverbs, the book of Job, I also note the book of Isaiah, the more I researched, is what the Summerians described as the, quote, celestial battle.
Ooh, this feels like we're going back to like early nukes episode a few weeks ago a little bit.
Well, I don't know, actually. And at this point, I think it's going to be different than you think. Okay. I think it's going to be more of like a physics thing. So, and one odd thing about this, I just want to give a shout out to this book. You should pick it up because it is fun to read. And it actually had me going back and reading the Bible a lot. I took a note that it's kind of sneaky, and Sitchin is kind of like sneaky wholesome, because he goes deep into his own theories, but he just kind of mentions the Bible summarily. So he'll say, here's this listing from a Sumerian text, and that's similar to Isaiah chapter 2. And he just doesn't go into it. So it forces you to like go read Isaiah chapter 2. Right. And so I found myself actually reading the Bible a lot the last 4 days. But this idea of a celestial battle, first I want you to think about the war in the heavens, God versus Satan, etc. It also ties into the similarities between Judaism and Babylonian religions, such as the divine council, Yahweh as the host of heaven, the Elohim and the war in heaven. And scholars believe that these were influenced by the Babylonian religion. And that's not him talking. It's both of us talking. That is apparently a belief, is that basically the Mesopotamian cultures heavily influenced what eventually became Judaism. And personally, as a Christian, I battled with this for a while because I've heard this for a while. And I have less and less problem with it the more I hear about it. And we could talk about this as we go on. But I don't think it necessarily makes the Bible any lesser. And in fact, it in some ways makes the Bible more, if that's a word.
It's not, but I
It's
understand.
not, yeah. And we'll get into that. So he makes this note that there are similarities basically between the Summerian battle in the heavens or celestial battle and like some quotes in early Hebrew scripture. So the Sumerians had this idea in their religion called the celestial battle, which details what he finds remarkably similar to the creation of our solar system. Scientists prior to the 20th century saw the solar system as very orderly, and that once it had been formed, and it remained relatively in its place. However, the Sumerians describe a number of mass collisions or celestial battles and resulting cosmic debris, which have more or less been confirmed by our exploration into space, including the Voyager expedition.
Man, what happened that people got really dumb for like a good chunk of like history as we know it?
I know. I was thinking that too. Like, what happens when you find out the Dark Ages wasn't 1000 to 1500? It was like 3000 BC to
Yeah.
19. Yeah,
It was like actually it's been going on since we've been recording history. Like there was this whole period before that where everybody was like smart and doing things.
yeah, it's weird. And then part of me says, okay, the farther you go back, the more stories there are. So there might be something that kind of accidentally hits on the truth. But the way it ties up with how this was like, I mean, the Sumerians and like the whole Mesopotamian area was really the first human culture. They had the first cities, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
They ended up influencing us, to this day. And reading into the influences into scripture, into Judaic and Christian scripture, some of it is undeniable. I mean, there are references directly to Marduk. You know what I'm saying? There are references to this that either put Yahweh like in contention with them, or sometimes even places him like in the story of the hero, where previously it was this other god.
Mm-hmm.
So according to what is called the Titus Bode Law, which was discovered by physicists in 1715, and is basically a mathematical formulaic prediction of the spacing of planets in our solar system, kind of based on Newton's laws of gravity, which are still remarkably useful today. They discovered in 1715 that there should be a planet in between Mars and Jupiter, where there is not. But you know what is? The asteroid belt, which we did not discover until years later.
Yeah.
And then there is Uranus, which Voyager discovered is tilted. And Sitchin asked if Uranus could have been the victim of some kind of massive collision. And actually, years later, this ended up being true. At a NASA press conference, scientists suppose that Uranus's tilted position is most likely the result of it being met with a collision with something about the size of Earth, traveling at 40,000 miles an hour.
Well, that's terrifying to think about.
That is
something the
terrifying.
size of Earth.
Traveling. What I found weird about this, I found this quote funny because I'm a 7-year-old. This is a real quote from NASA astronomer Gary Hunt. He said, "Uranus took an almighty big bang." What I found interesting was
in middle school.
We are in middle school. What I found actually most kind of weird, the more I thought about this, because this is some of my early notes, is size of Earth is huge.
Yep.
It makes me think of some of those big craft that we have seen, like going close to the sun, etc., and like NASA images. 40,000 miles an hour is slow.
Yeah.
If you compare
for stuff in space, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's very slow. So it's almost like it almost seems like it was an accident. Like there was some sort of big object and they were trying to like slow down or move. You know what I mean? Because like, in most accidents, they happen slower than what you were traveling before.
Yeah.
Like I slammed on the brakes and then I hit the thing. I think it's very weird that NASA says size of Earth, 40,000 miles an hour. It's something that's very
Somebody backed
big.
up their Death Star into Neptune or Uranus on
Right.
accident.
Right. It sounds like a cosmic backup
Like a little
accident.
fender bender happened.
And then and then the planet tilted, and it's just like when you hit a sign and it bends, and they're like, whoops, and then they just drive away.
Yep.
It's kind of what it looks like. It's weird.
They left a note. They left a note.
They left a note. Yeah, exactly.
Interesting.
So
I
this
hadn't
is
really ever thought about that, but yeah, that makes sense. But I mean, why else would it be tilted like that? It's a very weird. Everything it does is very weird.
yes, and he kind of gets into the math of it, and the way the moons act and stuff doesn't really seem like we call it tilted for a reason. Okay, like it's not just think about space. There is no up and down. There is no left and right. Like it's tilted because it's tilted. Like something's wrong. It doesn't act correctly. It's more tumbling instead of rotating. So like it makes intuitive sense that something happened to it.
Yeah.
If that makes any sense.
Otherwise, we would see other things out there floating in a similar fashion.
We don't. So he kind of uses the asteroid belt, which seems like pieces of a destroyed planet, and that this big planet that the Summerians had knowledge about is tilted as basically evidence towards proof that there's stories of some sort of celestial battle or like planet-wide collision occurred at some point, and that we witnessed this. So we're like 3 chapters into this at this point. And the second chapter was all about planets colliding into each other. And I found it funny. I had to laugh. I made a note that by the time we hit chapter 3, we're right back to the exact Genesis 1 in the beginning. It's the same title. We're like back to the beginning.
So he had like 2 thoughts for like the beginning of the book, and he just decided to put them both in.
Yeah, and I mean, it starts to pay off. It's just there's so much groundwork he has to lay. So I want to start now
with doing this show. I understand that feeling completely. Like, oh man, now I got to go figure out how to explain that. I need to get that note to figure out to go here to explain what that is.
I feel that way. I feel that way every episode, man. Like I go research and I include in my notes stuff that ends up not being relevant, but I think it's interesting. And then I'm like, man, if I was writing a book here, I'd be all over the place. And then So we go to another Catholic archbishop who was ahead of his time, James Ussher of Ireland in the mid 1600s. Now, Ussher is most famous for calculating how, if you read the book of Genesis literally, the exact year of the world's creation would be around 4000 BC.
Okay.
And I was actually surprised it took 1600 years to do that, because all you have to do is take the birth of Jesus and then go back, and it's literally all listed, right? But
yeah, it's pretty well listed at how long everybody lived. Like there's a lot of time reference in the Old Testament.
Right. There's literal dates of birth and death, and so this was somewhat surprising to me, but many Bible editions still use Ussher's calculations today, and include his calendars in their printings. And interestingly enough, that date seems to correspond with early Sumerian culture.
Okay.
Now, Sitchn contends, based on archaeological evidence, that Babylonian texts discovered in the late 1800s, which we did have a bunch of those, have remarkable similarities to Genesis, and in fact may be a sort of source material. He notes that the Anunnaki resemble the Nephilim, and I will note that he always uses the term Anunnaki / Nephilim. He believes these are the same thing.
Really? I haven't heard that before, but that actually makes a lot of sense, especially with the way, just in the little bit of research I've done on the Anunnaki, just passing by them and gathering stuff. They do share a lot of similarities as far as like sharing knowledge, which is something that, like, especially the Book of Enoch talks about in a lot of detail about how the Nephilim came down and taught men all these different things.
Yes, and in
And it
fact,
like names the demons basically. This one taught him this, and that's what he's in trouble for. And this one taught him that, and that's what he's in trouble for.
yes, it's a very similar theme, and in fact, they're described as similar in stature to the Nephilim. They're described as generally bringing scientific knowledge to human beings, knowledge of war, etc.
Oh, buddy, that was the connection I had not made. Now my head's spinning a little bit.
Yeah, this is why I love Sitchin. This book sucked me in. So we're dealing with similarities between Genesis and Babylonian culture, or what I'll call Near East or Sumerian culture, which is basically a string of empires with different names that shared very similar religions and whatnot. So there's the similarity of the Anunnaki resembling the Nephilim. There's, of course, the Epic of Gilgamesh, which I'm not prepared to get fully into, but it's generally considered to have very close similarities to the flood story of Noah. And then there's also an Akkadian text, which parallels Genesis, written in the Babylonian dialect. And I have included here, we may include this on YouTube, but I included basically a timeline of Mesopotamia culture, which shows that prior to about 2400 BC, the Summerians were in power. And this probably actually goes back to closer to 4000 BC. Samaria was replaced by the Emperor Akkad, who was basically Sumerian. This led into the Babylonians around 1800 BC and the Assyrians around 900 BC, building all the way up to what we would call Persia today. And the area of Babylon and Persia, just for listeners who aren't into this, Babylon is basically Iraq and Persia is basically Iran.
Okay.
So it's that area of the world around the Persian Gulf, and that's where all the big stuff happened, Tower of Babel, etc. So this timeline of kind of the creation of the earth as calculated by the Bible seems to fit in with when the beginnings of these empires were starting to take place. And then some of the mythology of these empires seems to have snuck its way into the Bible. It's more or less the thesis. And I'm really summarizing what he's saying, because he seems to take about 40 pages to say anything, despite giving a lot of information. So the big thesis here again is that we have a connection between when the biblical story historically begins, if you count back the dates, and then a lot of the mythological aspects of the big biblical story matching up with the Babylonian Sumerian mythology. Okay, so in 1902, L.W. King, who was an English archaeologist from Cambridge, studied many of these newly discovered tablets from the Sumerian cultures. And King showed that a number of the discovered fragments kept adding up to 7 tablets corresponding to the 7 days of creation. And in these 7 tablets, the first 6 always recounted the creation process, while the 7th was devoted to worship of the Lord, who at that time was the god Marduk for the Babylonians, or Ashur for the Assyrians. Interestingly, these gods seem to be both physical and transcendent, usually denoted by adding wings to their images or depicting them as gods with winged discs, which might be an interesting UFO connection. But the biggest connection here seems to be the 7-day creation pattern, where it took 6 days to create the earth, followed by 1 day of worship.
That is interesting, yeah, that they have the same, that's in their belief structure as well.
Right. Yeah. And again, as a Christian, I look at this and I have many different ways of seeing this. So, for one, the year is easily divisible by 7.
Mm-hmm.
364, 300. We have 365 days. 7 times 52 is 364, and we still use 52 weeks a year to this day. But it is interesting that the 7th day, for instance, is devoted to worship after the creation, which is very similar to Genesis, where God rested kind of in his temple he had created on earth. Now, Sitchin believes that the Hebrews adopted what would have actually been seen, and I love this. I could talk for hours about this. I've been thinking about it for a long time, and this book really put it into crystal clear words. Sitchin believes that the Hebrews adopted what would have been seen as basically a scientific view at the time, that there was this monotheistic universal God that solves the issues of duality, or the apparent divide between the spiritual and the physical. He describes this as science for 2 reasons. One, that I find very convincing and personally have come to look into a lot personally, is the fact that the separation of church and state, or the separation that we see between science and religion, basically has not existed for the thousands of years of human history until very recently. So a story about Noah's flood or Gilgamesh's flood would not be seen as like culturally threatening. It would just be seen, or as an issue of science or religion, it would just be seen as merely passed down knowledge.
Yeah, this happened.
Yeah, this happened. So, and I like that, because when people say there's a similarity between Noah's flood and Gilgamesh's flood, it's kind of like, if you understand the culture that those people lived in, it's kind of like, well, so what?
Yeah.
We renamed him, but we're telling a story of what happened.
Yeah.
And then it's the theological aspects that we're adding to it, which make it different. So, for instance, in Gilgamesh, the gods destroyed humanity because they were like making too much noise.
Yeah.
And in Noah, our God created a flood because there was sin.
Yeah.
So even if the story is the same, it's like the reasoning about the nature of reality. And it really becomes a question of, would the highest power care more about getting sleep at night, or would the highest power care more about how people treat each other?
Yeah.
And so in that way, when you understand that they weren't ripping off a religious story like we would think of it today, back then when it's just a fact, when you retell the story about how it's not many gods that are inconvenienced, it's one God who wants people to treat each other right, it becomes more of something that would be inspired by God.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
It's a retelling of human history as people understand it. So I think that's pretty convincing, actually.
Yeah.
And also a reason not to fear some of these similarities that people superficially think, means that this stuff isn't true. The fact is, there probably was a flood. All of human history recorded it. And why would that happen if there's a God in charge? And the answer is probably closer to the biblical answer than to the Summerian answer.
Yeah.
So it doesn't matter who told it first, it matters who told it right.
Yeah.
And everybody experienced the flood. So that's the first one. I found that I went on a tangent there. I apologize, but
No.
I find that super interesting, and it is based in the historical truth that they just did not see religions and science the way we see things today. Now, second, however, is the fact that Sitchin believes the Sumerian myths are literally true.
So he thinks the gods were
I mean, he
unhappy
believes
about the
they were
milk bubble.
aliens.
Oh, he believes they're aliens that were.
Yeah, I mean, he believes in general. I'm not just talking about Gilgamesh. I'm saying, like, in general, he believes that these are scientific for two reasons. One, that he goes into length about how science and religion weren't necessarily separate in the past, and two, they're just true. He just takes this as true.
Okay.
That the Anunnaki / Nephilim were real. And I'm going to quote from him here.
Well, I'm with him on that far. I thought we were talking about the Gilgamesh stuff, though. Like he was taking that as being.
Well, he takes the Sumerian. It's very interesting, and there's some reason for it, I guess, since they're like our oldest empire / civilization with writing. But Sitchin just really believes that whatever the Sumerians tell us is true.
Okay.
And I can't get inside his head.
I believe more than I don't believe at this point, really.
Right. And he's willing, like, as he proves in this book, to show that he doesn't necessarily believe in their religion, but he believes that more or less that the Sumerian mythology, and if I haven't driven this home enough, Sitchin believes that the Sumerian mythology is as close as you can get for an ancient person, like direct retelling of what happened.
Okay.
Which makes the Anunnaki or Nephilim people who came in from the skies, et cetera, et cetera. So here is a direct quote from him. He says, "I have repeatedly explained that the information of how things began, including how man was created, indeed did not come from the memory of the Assyrians or Babylonians or the Summerians, but from the knowledge and science of the Anunnaki or Nephilim," which again he sees as the same. "They too," he says, "of course, could not remember how the solar system was created or how the Nibiru Marduk invaded the solar system, because they themselves were not yet created on their own planets." So he's very clearly stating here that the Nephilim are aliens.
Yeah.
Basically. And that they...
Well, in the broadest definition, they are. They're not from this earth.
Correct. And the advanced knowledge, in his opinion, that they give us don't necessarily come supernaturally. He basically depicts them as like riding in, having all this advanced science, noticing what had happened just the same as we do with probes and stuff, and then like telling us about it. Like, oh yeah, there was this explosion here. There was this. So like,
they've just done their own research too, and they're obviously more advanced, especially at the time.
Right.
And so that's just what their science told them about what happened in the universe before they existed.
Correct. So they like float in from the solar system. They're like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 planets. We're going to stop on the third one. We're going to tell these monkeys here that there are this many planets. Here's what they look like. One of them is tilted. Also, there's an asteroid belt. That's kind of his theory. We're just kind of being told like a scientific stuff very early on, and the way it gets imprinted in myth is for that reason. So he then goes on to back to the Bible aspect, kind of elevate the Bible as being kind of the purest level of what we would call primordial science. And I found this very interesting. He notes that the Mesopotamian creation myths read as more of religious operas or opus, while Genesis reads as a more matter-of-fact version of the God of the universe ordering his creation from chaos, despite the similarities. And so kind of in this way, I found this interesting because I've heard many detractors say you stole this, kind of like the Noah story. You stole this from Babylonia. But when you really get into it, it's interesting, like the way it was stolen, like the way it was used. So in the Mesopotamian versions, there is Tiamat, And Tiamat is a ferocious primordial dragon, or for my research, sometimes this like goddess of the sea who creates like sea dragons.
Okay.
And Tiamat represents salt water. But in Genesis, there is the equivalent of Tiom, which translates as the deep, or like the deepest aspects of the ocean. And this is generally regarded by scholars as being a demythologizing part of the Babylonian creation telling.
Okay.
Now, there's also the term tohu wabohu in Genesis chapter 2, in the Hebrew of Genesis chapter 2. And this is the description of the world immediately before the creation of light, or before God says, let there be light. And this translates in the modern versions as either without form and void, and is also translated in Isaiah as being confusion and emptiness. So keep tohu wabohu in mind.
I will. I mean, that's just fun.
I know, isn't that a fun? Isn't that? What do you imagine sitting around a campfire like 2,000 years ago, hearing the scripture, and they say tohu wabohu, and that's like the way you begin the Bible.
I mean, I see like a Pacific Island culture, like on a beach.
Oh, it's Jews.
And
it's
there's
Jews.
Well, I don't know. Maybe it's just the Toho part. It makes me feel like Tiki Torches a little bit.
It's tohu wabohu. That should be our band name, man.
I mean, it needs to go on a T-shirt. It definitely needs to go on a
with
T-shirt.
a sea serpent. Oh my gosh. So at the end of the Sumerian creation myth, the ancient Sumerian creation myth called the Imuna Elish, which was handed down from the Summerians to the Babylonians and then to the Assyrians, which is how we discovered it in written form. There are some noted similarities to Genesis. And I'll quote here from the Imuna Elish. When up above the sky had not been named, down below the land had not been called by a name. Apsu, primeval, their begetter, Mamu, and Tiamat, she who gave birth to them all, mingled their waters together, and no pasture land had been formed, not even a reed marsh was to be seen. When the gods had not been brought into the being, they had not been called by name, their destinies had not been fixed. This goes on. I've looked into it.
Okay, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. I want to hear your thoughts, actually.
I was going to say, to me, based on everything else we've been hearing, that sounds like the beginning of the Anunnaki.
Ooh.
Like, because they're being viewed as gods, but they're this time when they don't exist. Because when you get into the Book of Enoch, and at some point we're going to have to dig farther into it, really. But it talks about how those angels that became the Nephilim that fell, God talks about how they learned a worthless secret and ran off from heaven, essentially. Like, they learned something, which to me was a big point of discovery, because you don't really think about angels necessarily having like a beginning, like other than just being created and they're there and they know whatever they know. Like, apparently that's not the case. Like, they go through like prep school and stuff, and like apparently this group that became,
they have a life.
Yeah.
They have a beginning in it. Yeah, right.
They were early on in their studies, and they thought they could basically like, oh, well, we could figure out, we could be God basically if we go do this based on this little bit of information we have. And then they came down here and did all this. And that, I don't know, that's really what that rings to me there, is that's the beginning of the Nephilim, Anunnaki, whatever you want to call them.
That might spin off, my friend. We might have to have an off-air conversation and make that into an episode, because that is because where I was
a lot of good Enoch research that I haven't used yet.
Where I was going to go with that, and I'll share my sources with you as well, is that basically this is notable because all of those names, Mumu, Aspu, Tiamat, are, as with other ancient religions, they're both simultaneously depictions of like lesser gods, but also forces of nature. So, and there's like a whole drama that I have not included in this episode between these, where like two of them, I'll get into it. I'll get into it.
Do you have a soap opera script that you can like send me?
It's kind of like that, actually. So I want to explain who these people are, though. Okay. So to understand all the similarities, we have to see that this list of gods are actually all synonymous with aspects of nature. So Asput is freshwater, Mumu is fog that forms above water, and Tiamat is salt water or the sea. And remember, Tiamat or Tohu is the ocean in the Bible
Yeah.
as well. Now, in the Near East myths, these gods do go on to interact, have children, strife, there's murder. But in some versions of so it actually, there's a whole thing that I left out of this episode, how these like lesser gods start to interact, which might actually really play into this whole angels thing. But we're not getting into it today. I didn't see a ton of significance of it, but now you're making me think.
Yeah, I might need this for the research I'm putting together. Wherever you got this part from, I may need to.
Okay, I will. I will. No, I'll send it to you. It's from that Amuna Elish, pretty much the creation myth of the Summerians. So, but here's the important thing. So, as this was handed down from the Summerians to the Babylonians to the Assyrians, Tiamat eventually became Tohu, and Aspu became Bohu. So saltwater and freshwater, Tohu and Bohu, is almost directly translated into the Hebrew Tohu Wabohu. And Hebrew scholars basically say that the "u" at the end of it almost certainly means it's not. These are not Hebrew words. So these are almost direct. These are almost certainly directly taken from Babylonian.
Interesting.
Okay. So Tohu Bahohu. It's my notes. The watery chaos of the literal at the beginning of the world, formless void, and matter ready to be formed. Almost pretty much literally translates into this earlier Sumerian culture's idea of these ancient like chaotic gods and sea dragons and stuff. And then Genesis demythologizes it down from this crazy opera to God set over the waters, which is why it's almost considered scientific for its time.
Yeah. Okay, I get that. Yeah, because everything else is explained in mythology, basically, where there's
right. It's the difference
to it.
It's like the god of the ocean had intercourse with the god of the swamps, and they made fog, which killed his mother, and then like the Bible is just like God sat over the waters.
Yeah,
and it uses the same terms, and it intentionally uses the same terms to demythologize, scientificize, and say there is one God. And that's what he's saying is so amazing. And like, this is almost a consensus among scholars that that's what the Jews were doing. So them taking words or concepts from other religions, again, just like in the Noah aspect, is a sign of making it. And again, when I say scientific, I don't mean modern scientific. It's a way of demythologizing things and saying this is the truth.
Yeah.
It's a deeper truth that we're trying to get here to as humans. So at this point, I'm gonna be honest, I started spiraling. I'm like, okay, I want to know now, because we're talking about the beginning of the world. I wanted to know, how is matter formed at all? And so I started searching around. I read a lot of great stuff. I found a good video that we'll link to in the descriptions called "Where Do Atoms Come From?" It's from a German theoretical physicist, Sabine Hostenfelder of the Frankfurt Institute. And this is not what I'm getting ready to describe, is not based just on her video, but it's based on other readings. And I tried to not get into esoteric things. I'm just trying to read like what the scientists say about the beginning of the universe. Does all of this line up? And weirdly, it does. So after the Big Bang, which we've already described as kind of a remarkable revelation that the Hebrews had, occurred what was called nucleosynthesis, or Big Bang nucleosynthesis, which is basically the creation of atoms. And so scientists actually, building on the Big Bang theory, have come to realize that in the minutes after the Big Bang, we had kind of a small universe compared to today, but it was still pretty big because it just banged, right? and that it was almost uniformly filled with matter, but no atoms existed. There were just all these subatomic particles, and it slowly, this is described as a field of plasma and described by different scientists as either an ocean or a big soup of nuclear constituents. This was an ocean of like possible matter.
Just floating around in space.
Floating around very close in space and like almost this liquid plasma type thing. So you basically have like this ocean of like possible atoms that could be pieced together, but
well,
no
you never
atoms.
think about liquid in space. I have no idea what doesn't it freeze? I mean, given that this
is technically plasma. It's water. Water is like H2O. We don't even have H yet, man. We're like not even getting there. What we have is like.
No, I'm just thinking about liquid in space. It's just a weird thing to think about. Just
it is
liquid without a container.
Imagine this. Imagine space as liquid, as like a room filled with like the possibility of different particles.
Yeah.
And you have some neutrons and some protons starting to form, some electrons, but nothing has been pieced together yet. And I just found it kind of poetic.
Yeah.
That like the early universe, according to science, if you believe the Big Bang Theory, which again is sort of Christian, resembled an ocean.
Yeah.
And it resembled this chaos. And that slowly, I'll refer people to that video, but you can also just Google Big Bang nucleosynthesis. Basically, slowly in that soup, things started to get close enough to create atoms, and then that ended up creating a star.
And you go back to God presiding over the water and it being this chaos, this unformed.
That's all I could think about. That's all I can think about is let there be light, and then you have this chaos ocean, and then you have slowly things start to piece together. Yeah. That's all I could think about when I was watching that video. And so that's my aside. Now let's go back to Sitchn. This is all about. This episode's gonna get me in trouble, isn't it? I'm getting too religious.
No, I'm enjoying it.
I don't care. Okay, now let's go back to Sitchn. Now he starts to get into the parallel between biblical texts and other writings. Now I found this. There's a lot of examples, but I wanted to narrow it down. I found this one very interesting. So in Job, which many people consider actually the oldest written down book of the Bible, chapter 26, number 7. I'm going to read the New International Version, which is like the most modern version you can read outside of something ridiculous. It said, of God, it says that he spreads out the northern skies over empty space, and he suspends the earth over nothing. So
that sounds like the earth floating around in space.
It sounds like the earth's floating around in space. It sounds like stretching the earth out and then letting it float around in space. And it gets even better because in Hebrew, and I use the Bible Hub is great. If you go to Bible Hub, you can read any version of the Bible in print, and then it will actually translate every sentence into its Hebrew components. I wanted to fact check Sitchn here because Sitchn made a claim, and I went to fact check it. So I'll just say what's true. He claimed that empty space translated into tohu. I checked it out. It's real.
Wow.
So God stretched out tohu. He stretched out this chaos dragon. Now this describes God hanging the earth in what sounds like empty sky or space, which is pretty remarkable to begin with. But the parallels with Mesopotamian texts here is that in those texts, in the Babylonian texts, the god Marduk killed the chaos ocean dragon Tiamat, or Tohu, stretching her out to create the world.
Yeah, it's the same thing in a more dramatic.
Again, yeah, exactly. If you go back to the Summerians, it's basically Zeus killing a undersea dragon and then stretching her out and creating the world. In the Bible, it just says God stretched out the chaos and created the world. Like it's just a creation of. It's so incredible. So the Mesopotamian texts go on to describe how Marduk cuts off a piece of Tiamat's tail to create the asteroid belt. And Sitchn notes that in Genesis, when God separates the, quote, upper waters from the lower waters, the world, or more or less the world that we generally translate. Oh, no, okay. Genesis goes on to say that when God separates the upper waters from the lower waters, if you read Genesis, he separates them from what we call the firmament.
Mm-hmm.
So the word that we generally translate as firmament, literally in Hebrew, means the hammered out bracelet. Thus, according to, if you combine these two stories, according to Sitchin, the asteroid belts are the remnants of Tiamat and are the hammered out area of the heavens, which create a sort of firmament between our sphere of influence and the rest of the heavens.
Interesting.
Yeah, and it gets
So
even
those would
deeper.
be the upper waters, and I'm assuming.
Mm-hmm. So basically, the idea is that the asteroid belt is the firmament. It's a piece of and we're gonna get into our cliffhanger here pretty soon, but the asteroid belt is a piece of a missing planet or a piece of an existing planet that separates upper waters from lower waters, and that the Bible calls a firmament. And that the lower waters are basically Mercury, Venus, Earth, and Mars. And he goes on to describe basically how it's pretty likely that all these planets had water. So Mercury is so close to the sun that it would just dry up immediately.
Yeah.
Venus, we used to think was so hot because it's close to the sun, but our exploration of it has shown that Venus actually is in some sort of greenhouse effect.
Well, if you believe Valiant Thor, they live inside the planet, and to link the inner Earth stuff, the Hollow Earth stuff, like it kind of lines up with what Thor was saying about living inside Venus.
Right, yeah, that, and then just basically generally, it's not just so hot you can't exist. It's so hot because there's a greenhouse effect. So there could be water. Earth obviously has water, and as we know, Mars has, we basically proven it had or has water.
It had it. It likely still does. It's just so far down there.
Right. So those would be the lower waters, and then you have the firmament or the asteroid belt, and then you have the outer waters or the upper waters. And Sitchin goes into length. I looked into this as well. Like Jupiter, obviously, is a gaseous planet, but many of its moons have ice.
Yeah.
They have waters. Saturn, the same. Also, there's some dispute about whether or not Saturn, there might be some sort of rocky core inside of the gas, which might have waters. And then, of course, Neptune and he keeps going back to Neptune and Uranus are watery with ice, and we expected those to be gas, but for some reason they're not. So this is his way of explaining that Genesis explained this truth. I'm not sure where I'm at on this. I think it's an interesting parallel.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if sometimes I feel like Sitchin almost attacks his own ideas, because even though if we find out every planet basically has waters, that'd be significant, and there's this dividing line of he doesn't seem interested really in this book of explaining Genesis. He seems more interested in fitting Genesis into his pre-existing theories, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So he hits on some amazing things because he's super intelligent, but I don't know. I see, if, for instance, the chaos that God was presiding over, I don't know. We'll keep going here, but we're near here. Do you have any thoughts?
I mean, nothing to add right at the second, no.
Okay, so at this point, he pretty much reiterates that he's seeing Genesis as like a literal scientific description of things. Okay, this might be our cliffhanger, Patrick. Okay. I called this part 3, but it's really about 40% of the way through this giant book. Gaia, the cleaved planet. Okay, here we go. We have been basically primed for this rabbit hole. this is where I just started reading and taking notes because I was like, where is this going? Sitchin asks to begin this chapter, why do we call our planet Earth?
I don't know.
He asked the big questions. Another question we're gonna get into in future episodes is, was Adam the first test tube baby? But that's that's to be decided. But that's a literal question. So Sitchin notes a number of similarities to the different words used by different cultures and languages for planet Earth. In German, it's Erd. Icelandic and Danish use Jord. Middle English was Earth, which should not be super surprising because we speak English. And the Gothics use Aertha. And he goes on into ones that are not European. For instance, in Aramaic, it's Aratha. In Kurdish, it's Erd. And in Hebrew, it's Earths. So I'm assuming this is just to mean that we all use the same word miraculously for Earth. That Erd, Jord, Earth, Eartha, Aratha, Erd, all sound very much like Earth. And so that's supposed to mean something. They're close. And I went down, I probably wasted half a night on this research hole, and the answer is no. Not all cultures have the same word for Earth. All you have to do is Google. This was written in 2003 by a man born in 1925, so I'm not gonna diss him here. He's a great scholar, but this is not the truth. Not every culture uses the same word for Earth. However, I will note that all the ones that do use something close to the word Earth do appear either in Europe or in this Aramaic, Hebrew, Kurdish context near like the Persian Gulf. And that might be more of what he's trying to show. So I'm going to indulge his view for now. So Sitchin notes that the sea that we now call the Arabian Sea, which leads to the Persian Gulf, and this is the area where his Annunaki and Nephilim friends first taught us war and science and the evils of makeup, as we've learned, is named in antiquity. In antiquity, that sea is actually named Earthia.
Okay.
Which is surprisingly similar again to Earth. And he knows that Urdu in Persian still means encampment or settlement to this day. So let's take a look at this point at his reading of the Summerian text about the Anunnaki or Nephilim's first arrival, which was sort of a survival colonist party here on Earth. These texts report that there were about 50 Anunnaki and Nephilim who came to Earth. I would love to check this with your research, by the way.
50 is a little high, but Enoch doesn't name all of them. He basically names what it appears to be leaders. There isn't a lot of them, though. So 50 actually does make sense. That doesn't sound too high as far as lining up with what Enoch would have said about.
It's like a party. It's like a party is in like a colonist party, not like a party. You know what I mean? Yeah. So he believes that 50 of them came under the command of someone known as EA.
And I'd have to look. That isn't exactly the name, but we'd have to do some research on what I'm blanking on what. There's a couple different angels. There's one that really gets credited as being the leader.
We do have to do research because this EA is actually, I put it in quotes because it's two characters put together that we would say today as EA. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So this could actually be numerous different names depending on the language used.
Okay.
But he interprets it as he whose home is in water.
That makes me think of UFOs flying into the ocean.
Yeah, I know. That's what I thought too.
Well,
also the beast of the sea in Revelation.
Yep.
he says that they landed on Earth, splashing down on the Arabian Sea, and waded ashore into the marshlands in the area that now would be the Persian Gulf, but at the time would be more of a jungly type region, as we know with science. So they would have basically come ashore right where the Babylonian culture's stuff began.
Oh, interesting.
They called this new encampment Eridu, meaning home in the faraway. And thus, we are still named to this day after the title given to us by the Anunnaki or Nephilim invaders.
Huh.
Eridu, I wrote down a string of this to see how it sounds together. Eridu, Earth.
Yeah.
It's kind of the way I saw it playing out when I looked at the other languages. So it would make sense though, because if this happened 6,000 years ago, the other languages that don't have similar words probably would have already spread across Earth, right?
Mhm.
So like the Chinese wouldn't share the Anunnaki word because they were already in China.
Yeah.
So, I'll give the guy the benefit of the doubt. So almost without explanation, we're going off the deep end here. Sitchin says that Ea had crafted 5 settlement colonies on Earth and then was given the title of Enki, or Lord of Earth, which he bases off of Summerian mythology. Here we get into the linguistics of the Nephilim. The En in Ea's name for his new title, the En was modified to Ea for his new title, kind of in the linguistics of whatever language we're talking about here. And then the Ki in Enki is a word that we eventually came to know as to hollow out, extract, mine, excavate, exploit, etc. in the Sumerian Babylonian languages.
Really?
Yeah. So he was basically renamed from he who comes from waters to he who hollows out or exploits the earth.
Lord of Earth exploiter is what I'm hearing.
Yes.
Sounds like Satan.
It's interesting because like in the Bible, like Abraham and Abraham, I mean, like people's names would be changed in these ways. So this is basically telling the story of someone who came for the water and then conquered Earth to hollow it out.
All right.
So more interestingly, and this kind of helps the whole Earth thing, Sitchin notes that the Ki in Enki was linguistically changed over time to Gi or J from the Summerians to the Babylonians, and that this is very similar to the Gaia or Geo, which scholars agree the Greeks borrowed from the myths of the Near East. So not only is Earth or whatever supposed to sound like Earth, but Gaia became Gaio Geo, which the Greeks took to mean the Earth.
Okay.
So it's kind of further evidence that. So I went on a side note here. Interestingly, the god Enki is a real Sumerian god of wisdom. And get ready for this: fresh water, trickery, mischief, crafts, magic, exorcism, fertility, and art.
Well, those are all things that the Nephilim were passing on. Well, I mean, mischief, obviously. But a lot of this stuff is stuff that they passed on, essentially, or taught humans about.
Yes.
According to Enoch.
Exactly.
And according to this, apparently.
According to this, right.
According to a lot of different stuff, apparently.
And I might leave us here because at this point, he starts going down a rabbit hole of Greek mythology, how it relates to the Near East, and those connections to the Hebrew scriptures, which gets pretty complicated. But I'll leave you with a tantalizing take, if you will.
Okay.
According to ancient knowledge, Earth was not an original member of the solar system. It was a cleaved off half of a planet called Tiamat, she who bore them all. The celestial battle that led to the creation of Earth occurred several 100 million years after the solar system with its planets had been created. Earth, as part of Tiamat, retained much of the water that Tiamat, the quote, watery monster, was known for. As Earth evolved into the independent planet and attained the shape of a globe dictated by the forces of gravity, the waters were gathered into the immense cavity on the torn off side, and dry land appeared on the other side of the planet. This, in summary, is what the ancient peoples firmly believed. And what do modern scientists say? The theories concerning planetary formation hold that they started as balls congealing from the gaseous disk extending from the sun. As they cooled, heavier matter, iron in Earth's case, sank into the centers, forming a solid inner core. A less solid plastic or even fluid outer core surrounded the inner one. In Earth's case, it's believed to consist of molten iron. The two cores and their motions act as a dynamo, producing the planet's magnetic field. Surrounding the solid and fluid core is a mantle made of rocks and minerals. On Earth, it is estimated to be 1,800 miles thick. He goes on to state that this process that produced over billions of years a spherical orb, the uniform force of gravity, and the planet's rotation around its axis, should also result in an orderly layering, which he's going to argue it does not. The solid inner core, the flexible or fluid outer core, the thick lower mantles of silicates, and the upper mantle of rocks, and the uppermost crust should encompass one another in orderly layers, which Earth seems to not. Is Gaia, or Enki, a living planet trying to heal her wounds? The most obvious place on the surface of the Earth where it was wounded is the Pacific Ocean. While the average plunge in the Earth's surface in the oceanic parts is about 2.5 miles. In the Pacific, the crust has been gouged out to present depth, reaching at some point 7 miles. If we could remove from the Pacific's floor the crust built up there over the last 200 million years, we would arrive at depths of 12 miles below the water surface and between some 20 to nearly 60 miles below the continental surface. This is quite a cavity. How deep was it before the crustal buildup over the past 200 million years? How large was the, quote, wound 500 million years ago, or a billion years ago, or 400 billion years ago? And I think we see where he's going. He's going to argue that the Earth is literally Tiamat, that we were once two planets, that the asteroid belt is a missing chunk from what was our planet, and that we have evidence for this in our oceans, with the fact that we're 3/4 water and that there are these gigantic depths and holes in our oceans, basically.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't know that about the Pacific. I didn't know it went that deep.
It goes pretty deep. It goes, climbing to the highest mountain is nothing compared to going to the deepest depths of the ocean. And I had to fact check this. I will never use that term again, but I had to check that out. And our oceans are scary deep. We do, I'm not saying I believe this, but we do have a big old gash in our planet, basically. We are not a ball. If you take away the water and you just look at us, we're like some Earth, and then like 2/3 is like deep holes.
Yeah.
Where the ocean goes deep. We don't look like Mars.
No.
We don't look like Mercury. We don't look like, we look weird. And it's weird. I had never thought of this before. We're not a uniform. We're not only not a ball, we're kind of more shaped like this. And he gets into that too, as we'll go into in a sequel. But we are we're like an apple that's been eaten parts out of, and that's not necessarily normal. And he kind of uses the fact that the asteroid belt isn't the size of a full planet to basically say the asteroid belt is a part of Earth.
Huh.
That something happened cataclysmic. The separation of Tohu and Bohu, and that part of it was stretched out into Earth and the other part was stretched out into the firmament. And that's where he's going here.
Okay.
And that's kind of where I ended, because I was like, I think I get it now. Because I was like, where are you going? And it occurred to me finally that he's saying scientifically the Earth and the asteroid belt are one thing. And there was some sort of big historic event explained by religion where a god figure of some sort or some sort of cataclysmic collision separated us. And our big holes are evidence that the asteroid belt should fit in. And then all these other theories that the asteroid belt should be a planet, but it's too small, are evidence that they are part of Earth. Okay. And the question is, what happened? And that's where we'll leave you.
Oh yeah, you're gonna have to do a follow-up on this. This is very interesting. I enjoyed it quite a bit, and again, weird overlap with other things. Just all over the place.
We need to do a Sitchn Annunaki kind of powwow about that in the Nephilim.
Agreed.
Yeah. So that's it. Thank you for listening. Please like, share, subscribe. If you're on YouTube, hit that bell. If you are on iTunes or Spotify, share this with your friends. Give us a 5-star rating. Give us a 4-star rating. You know what? If 100 of you gave us a 4-star rating, I would appreciate that more than one 5-star rating.
I mean, they could all just give us 5-star ratings.
Or you could give us all. If you're gonna do what I'm saying, just give us a 5-star rating. Please, we are so thankful. We are coming up. I believe in 2 weeks is our 1-year anniversary. In 2 weeks, February 11th. In 2 weeks is our 1-year anniversary, which means I get to start year 2. We are already in season 2, but I get to start year 2. So thank you so much for everything you've done. Please, show us some love. And again, even if you're just faithfully downloading, share it with a friend. Talk to someone about what you're learning. Let's create a society that talks about interesting ideas. And that's my show for the week, Patrick.
Awesome. Well, thank you for putting it together, Dennis. It was fun.
All right. Well,
I'll be back next week, and I don't know what I'm doing. There's a few different things floating around that are partially researched, and this may spin me off in another direction, so we'll see.
That's how we always.
Yeah.
I wish at some point at the beginning of season 3, we need to make a list of everything we plan on doing, and then we need to compare it
with what actually happens.
What we actually have. It's because it's gonna be insane. All right, thank you everyone for listening. God bless y'all. Tune in a couple weeks, I guess, to hear part 2 of what's going on with Earth. Are we part of the asteroid belt? What's going on with Genesis? Where did that come from? And maybe in the future, the truth about Anunnaki and the Nephilim. But we are all over it. I love you, Patrick.
I love you too. Tohu wabohu.
Tohu wabohu.